Today we're going to continue our series in understanding the conquest of Canaan, and this is going to be part 2. Kind of a delay in it coming up, but for some reason the title isn't. There we go. And we're going to continue looking into the topic of the conquest of Canaan. And we're going to be answering the question of why God commanded the Israelites to enter into specific cities and utterly destroy the people who were living there. I want to kind of gauge you guys on this. Have you read through Deuteronomy and Joshua in the past and ran across these verses where God is telling the Israelites, go in and utterly destroy everyone? Children, women, everyone. And you kind of pause and think, did I just read what I think I read? It seems hard to imagine when you square it with the teaching of Jesus, if we're honest. And I remember years ago reading through these verses and coming to the conclusion there has to be a good reason why God told them to do this. I just don't know what it is. And I don't know anyone who I could ask and them give me an answer based on what Scripture says. And so I began looking into the matter for myself because I wanted to understand how this land, inhabited by different people groups, became this land, inhabited by Israelites who had destroyed the people groups who were living in this area by the command of God. And I explained as I introduced this last week, to answer this takes looking at the big picture and understanding how God has developed the story of the Bible, and in particular, looking into the book of Genesis and understanding some key events throughout the book of Genesis. I explained how you have 1,656 years that pass and only 6 chapters of the entire Bible dedicated to that portion of time. And when you look at the timeline, you can see that 1,656 years is a pretty good chunk of what we know as human history. And so this is where we can glean from other writings that were used even by the apostles and Jesus himself. And we focused on the first major event that you see on the timeline, the flood, and what led to the flood and how God used the flood to bring about judgment on the earth and to eradicate the earth of the wickedness and the corruption that had taken place. And Genesis chapter 6 gives us a little bit of information about the lead up to the flood, but nothing like we find in what is found in other literature that was used by the Jews in the first century, and that is in the book of Enoch. And we need to understand something that is briefly mentioned in Genesis to understand the conquest. And this is something that I learned from investigating the matter thoroughly for weeks and weeks. And that is to understand Genesis chapter 6 in verse 4. It says that there were Nephilim on the earth in those days being the days that preceded the flood, and also afterward, which is the days after the flood. So basically there were Nephilim, or in some English translations, giants on the earth before the flood and after the flood. And it tells us how. When the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men, Giborim, who were of old, the men of renown. And we spent a great deal of time establishing the fact that the sons of God cannot be anyone other than angels, divine beings created by God, divine beings who witness creation and were privy to knowledge that far exceeds the knowledge that humans had or have. And we looked into Enoch, and we saw where it explains in much greater detail what happened before the flood. And I want to revisit that because so many in the church are unfamiliar with the book of Enoch, though they should not be, but they have been told by people in the Protestant realm not to read these books because they're not in the 66, the Protestant Bible. But little do they know that there was no Protestant Bible for over 1,500 years before the Protestant Bible came to be. And so the early church utilized resources that go far beyond what we have in the Protestant Bible. And those resources are even quoted by the apostles, as I will show you here in just a moment, as we witnessed last week as well. But I want to read from Enoch, and it will tell us a fuller story of what preceded the flood. So I'm going to try to read through this pretty quick because we covered it last week. So stay with me. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, Come, let us choose us. Sounds similar, doesn't it? Let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children. And Semyaza, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will indeed agree to do this deed. You will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. So the ringleader, he's like, I'm afraid if we agree to do this, that some of y'all may back out. Therefore, they all answered him, Let us all swear by an oath and devote one another to mutual destruction, not to turn back from this decision until we complete it and do this deed. Notice that I have swear by an oath and devote one another to mutual destruction because it is utilizing a word that is very dominant in Deuteronomy and in Joshua. It's the Hebrew word cherem, which occurs 50 times in the verb form and 29 times in the noun form, and in particular in relation to the conquest. Why is that? Let me back up here just a moment. So you have these angels who decide we're going to have children. We're going to get us some wives, and we're going to procreate, and we're going to have our own children. And they swear that they are going to carry out this thing where they come to the earth, where they leave the heaven, and they come to the earth, and they procreate with women, what is known to be Nephilim, or giants. And so they swear using this word cherem, and they say, and basically they're saying, let us be utterly destroyed if we don't do this. We're committing to it, and if we back out, let us be utterly destroyed. And the irony of this is because they do this, they're going to be utterly destroyed, and so will their offspring. And that is something that will dominate the conquest, is the use of this word. Because when you read in your English Bible, especially like in the King James or the New King James, when it is said, go in and utterly destroy or devote to destruction, and like the ESV or NET, it's that word, cherem. And it's usually in the he feel, the causative verb form, which means you make it happen. And so by them swearing, using this word, and committing themselves to do this deed, they are basically saying, we will be utterly destroyed if we don't carry it out. But, again, the irony is they will be utterly destroyed because they do carry it out. So this word is going to be turned and used on them in a way that is different than they had planned. So we will highlight that word as we get into the conquest in Deuteronomy and Joshua here in just a moment. It says, then they all made a vow together and put each other under a curse in regard to this. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And so they descended in the days of Jared, which would be between 460 to 1422 after creation, which is a pretty big span, but I think you can narrow it closer to the life of Enoch when it started, because you have Enoch confronting the watchers, and it seems to be happening during his lifespan and probably continued afterwards because he's caught up, and then you have him confronting them even more. It's kind of confusing to follow an Enoch and put a precise chronology on it, but we do know that it was in the days of Jared and most likely starting surrounding the time of Enoch. So again, we're looking at the big picture, working our way up to the flood. So there were 200 of them, and they descended on Mount Hermon, and that's why and he's telling us why it became known as Mount Hermon. If you read the Hebrew Bible, you know that a lot of times people and places are named in association with a word that describes something relative to them. And so they call this mountain, the peak of this mountain, Mount Hermon, because it's a word play on their agreement. Let us be utterly destroyed if we don't carry this thing out. So that's the agreement, the cherem, and so they make it a noun, and they call it Mount Hermon, cherem, Hermon. And it says, because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And this is Mount Hermon. If you're looking at the screen, this is the Sea of Galilee to the north, and to the northeast of this valley here is Mount Hermon. At the base of it, for those who have gone to Israel, is Caesarea Philippi. Chapter 7. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives, and each chose for himself one. And they began to go in to them and to defile themselves with them. And they taught them charms and enchantments and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells or cubits, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind. And they began to sin against birds and beasts and reptiles and fish, and to devour one another's flesh and drink the blood. Then the earth laid accusation against the lawless ones. Azazel taught humans to make swords, weapons, shields, breastplates. the lessons of the angels, and they showed them their mining and craftsmanship, anklets and adornment, powders and painted eyes, and all kinds of choice stones and dyeing. And there arose much godlessness, and they committed fornication, and they were led astray and became corrupt in all their ways. And this is exactly what Genesis 6 describes as well. The imagination of man's heart was evil continually, and God was sorrowful that He had created man. Simyaza taught enchantments and root cuttings, Armaros the resolving of enchantments, Barachiel taught astrology, Kochavel the constellations, Ezekiel the knowledge of the clouds, Arachiel the signs of the earth, Shamsiel the signs of the sun, and Sariel the course of the moon. And as men perished, they cried, and their cry went up to heaven. That's just a snippet, and you can read all the way through chapter 16 in Enoch if you want to see the full picture of that. And if you don't have the book of Enoch, we actually have an Apocrypha here that includes it and other writings in the Apocrypha. It's back there if you want to get a copy after service. But let me further demonstrate how this was clearly read by the early church, the first century church, and utilized by the apostles. Because again, you're going to be taught in the Protestant realm a lot of ridiculous stuff, and one of those things is not to read the Apocrypha. Don't read the Catholic Bible. And the reality is you should. You should read it. And the early church used it, and they used writings such as Enoch. Matter of fact, let me show you where they quote it. An apostle on record, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment. And notice that he explicitly links these angels who sinned in this passage to the days of Noah, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. In a parallel text, Jude also utilizes Enoch. And matter of fact, in verse 6, he is quoting from Enoch, and I will show you that. I didn't show you this last week, but I will show you. And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. Enoch chapter 12, when Enoch goes to confront the watchers and to basically tell them, your plea for forgiveness and reconciliation has been denied. Enoch, thou scribe of righteousness, go declare to the watchers of the heaven who have left the high heaven, the holy eternal place, and have defiled themselves with women, and have done as the children of earth do, and have taken unto themselves wives. You have wrought great destruction on the earth. In chapter 15, verse 3, it says this, on what account, and this is directed to the watchers, on what account did you abandon the high holy heavens of eternity and sleep with the women and be defiled with the daughters of humans and take women for yourselves? You acted just like the sons of the earth, and you fathered children for yourselves, giant sons. And so it matter-of-factly states that they created giants, or the Nephilim, at the hands of the angels, and this was quoted in Jude. Jude is quoting it in verse 6. And he not only does he quote it in verse 6, but he also is descriptive of the kind of sin that they committed. And it's like the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them in a similar manner to these. These is the preceding verse. Having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh. flesh that is different than angels, humans. When you read the story of Lot being in Sodom and the angels come to Lot's house, what were they trying to do? Beat down the door. And what did they say to the angels? Let them come out that we may know them, that we may sleep with them. And they are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. And then he even mentions Enoch a few verses later in verse 14. Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men, also saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of His saints, these men being false teachers. Because in Jude and in 2 Peter, the whole discourse is, yeah, they're wreaking havoc, but they're not going to get away with it forever. Just like the angels, just like Sodom and Gomorrah, just like the days before the flood. And they're utilizing these ancient stories as evidence that God will not delay judgment forever. It will come. And it says in verse 15, to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against Him. And so now that we better understand the flood, we're also mindful of what God said after the flood, because there was self-war amongst the Nephilim before the flood, but all of them wouldn't have been killed. And I think part of the reason for the flood was to do away with them and the corruption that they had caused amongst humans. And so we had the flood. But what did God say after He flooded the earth? I won't do it again. I will not flood the earth again. So what if the angels come back and do what they did all over again? And we read in Genesis 6 that they did, because there were giants before the flood and after the flood. How's He going to get rid of them? He can't flood the earth again. So what is God to do to get rid of them? The conquest. That's what we're working towards. And so we have the story of the flood. And then when you go from the flood in Genesis 7 through 9, then in Genesis 10 you have what's called the Table of the Nations. The Table of the Nations is showing us Noah and his 3 sons and their lineages and where they ended up settling in the known world at that time. But what we don't understand often is that Genesis 10, the Table of the Nations, and where people groups ended up is a result of what happened at the Tower of Babel, where everybody was together in one place, building their tower to the heavens, and God said, not so fast. He confounded their language. There was a catastrophic earthquake, and that's where we have Pangea. If you want to hear more on that, you can go to the Diving Deeper Genesis series, go to chapter 10 and 11, and I'll talk about that in more detail. I don't have time to do that today. But that is a significant event that is underplayed and under-realized in human history, and it really is helpful for setting the backdrop to understanding a lot of the Old Testament stories. So God uses the flood. He uses a massive earthquake in the judgment of Babel. The nations are spread. People are dispersed across the globe. In the meantime, there's this guy right here, Abraham, who is born 40 years before the Tower of Babel. And he happens to be living in the area where this tower was built. And God comes to him and tells him to leave Ur. To leave Ur. And so he leaves Ur and he goes to Haran. And this is where in Genesis it starts focusing on Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And from there on, the rest of the entire Old Testament is about Abraham and his offspring. Like the rest of the Old Testament. And so he goes from Ur to Haran. Then when he's 75, God calls him to leave Haran to go to Canaan. And so he leaves Haran and he goes to Canaan. And while he's in Canaan, he's in Hebron. And zone in here just to give you an idea of where it is. Southwest of Jerusalem, about 20 miles or so. In Genesis calls it the plains of Mamre. And I want to show you a story where he's 75 years of age plus, probably closer to 80 if I were guessing. We can't know for sure, but this is what happens, and I want to read this to you. When the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Avram, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. And he said unto Avram, Know of a surety that your seed, your offspring, shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them for 400 years. What is this a reference to? The offspring of Abraham being in Egypt for 400 years. And that's what the rest of Genesis works toward. It focuses on Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob has the 12 tribes, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. But in the process of all that, Joseph, the beloved son, is sold by his jealous brothers where? To those who end up in Egypt. And he ends up in Egypt, comes to power, and that's what Genesis works toward, Abraham's offspring being in Egypt, just like God is saying right here. They're going to be a stranger in a land that is not theirs. They are going to serve them and afflict them for 400 years. But watch what he goes on to say. And also that nation whom they shall serve, I will judge. And afterward they shall come out with great substance. When does that happen? What's the event called? Exodus. The Exodus. He goes on to say this, As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age. Anybody know how long he lived? 175 years. Verse 16, and they shall come back. Notice the promise. Here in the 4th generation, after 400 years, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. You ever read that verse and thought, I wonder what the iniquity of the Amorites is? Because it has to be complete before God brings the children of Abraham back to the land of Canaan. And so God's content to let the story develop and let the Amorites sin and commit iniquity. And we should all, as we read things like this in the Bible, I mean, in the midst of a promise to Abraham, hey, you're going to have offspring, they're going to go away for 400 years, but they're going to come back, but they can't come back until the Amorites, the fullness of their iniquity, reaches its climax. And so when we read that, we should immediately ask the question, who are the Amorites? And what the heck are they doing? And why is God letting them do that? Because Abraham's offspring returning is contingent upon what we see in verse 16. And so when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces, the animals that Abram had cut in half so they could karat barit, they could cut covenant and walk between the pieces, forming a covenant. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Avram, saying, to your offspring, I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so the rest of Genesis is about developing the offspring of Abraham and getting them to Egypt, so that when we get to Egypt after 400 years, you can have the Exodus. Now, let me explain a little bit about the timeline that may have caused confusion, and some have asked about it. And the timeline starts here with creation, and until here, these figures are after creation. This many years after creation, 1,656 years after creation, 1,988 years after creation. But when we get to here, I switch over to BC, because we're working our way towards Christ. So this figure right here, it's approximately 2,000 years after creation, but it's also approximately 2,000 years before Christ. Okay, so we switch to BC, and the Exodus takes place around 1446 BC. Okay, so the Israelites had been in Egypt for 400 years. The iniquity of the Amorites has reached completion. God sends Moses into Egypt to rescue his people and to bring them to the land that he had promised to Abram. And so you have the book of Exodus. And that's what Exodus is pretty much all about. You have the development up to the actual Exodus itself in Exodus chapter 12. They go out into the wilderness, and God has to groom the Israelites to be able to possess the land of Canaan. He takes them out into the desert. He tests them. He tries them. He checks their hearts. He gives them the law in the desert at Pentecost. And from there they go to Kadesh Barnea in the Negev. And at Kadesh, they send 12 spies into the land to assess the land and to give a report. Now, let me help you. They leave Egypt, and it takes them over 13 months before they're at Kadesh. And from Kadesh, they send the spies, just over a year removed from leaving Egypt. And God is going to take them into the land, but they send the spies, and you know the story. 10 of the spies come back, and they're fearful, and Joshua and Caleb come back, and they're saying, you know, there's some things that are interesting there, but God's got this. God said we can, and we just need to follow through with it. But I want you to, and this is the route that they took. They're at Kadesh. They travel through the entire land of Canaan. And here's another look with some of the locations named. And in Numbers 13, here's what happens when the spies return. And at the end of 40 days, they return from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and to all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, or you could say in modern vernacular, and on top of that, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Who are the descendants of Anak? Stay tuned, because we're going to find out. And could it be related to the Amorites? What is going on with the Amorites? Verse 29. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev, the Amalekites being descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. Now, at this point, they're using specific references to different people groups. Later on in the development of this, especially from Joshua, after Joshua, a lot of times anyone living in Canaan would broadly be called Canaanites. Okay, but here we're using specific terms. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Then the man who had gone up with him said, "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are." Can you imagine? God has been waiting all this time, allowing the iniquity of the Amorites and the inhabitants of Canaan for their iniquity to reach its climax, so He can bring His people, Abraham's descendants, into the land to possess the land. And here He brings His people. They send spies and they come back and they're like, no, we don't want to mess with them. They're big. They're bigger than us. And Caleb's like, no. I often think about, a little digression here, I often think about Joshua and Caleb and how they had to just sit there in the desert for 40 years. After they were ready and willing to go in and take the land, 40 years before they actually did. I mean, you talk about having to reel in your attitude for 40 years because everyone else around you has caused you to have to stay in the wilderness. It wasn't their fault they had to stay in the wilderness. They were ready to go. But the people overruled them. And the majority, who'd they side with? The majority. There were 12 spies. 10 came back with a report that was fearful. And who did the people go with? Some of y'all still haven't done that many and few. And you really should. Because in our culture, we're conditioned to think more is better. And that's not always true. So they brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land they had spied out, saying, "The land through which you have gone to spy it out, it is a land that devours its inhabitants. And all the people that we saw in it are of great height." So what did they just tell us? What is the iniquity of the Amorites? Procreating with the watchers. There are giants in the land. That's why they're fearful. They go in the land, we always see as big people. They're tall. They have weapons. We ain't doing it. Can you imagine how that made God feel? His people against the adversary's people. those created in His image and those created in their image. And His are scared. How many of you think that really ticked God off? How do we know? Because with this story, if you keep reading, God says, that's it. That's the final straw. You want to be fearful? You don't want to trust me? Your carcasses will fall in this wilderness right here. You will not enter Canaan. And God doles out severe and harsh punishment because they won't go into the land. And they all die in the wilderness except for Joshua and Caleb. Now here's the verse that's very helpful. And there we saw the Nephilim. Now who are the Nephilim? Remember Genesis 6? The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came to the daughters of men. They bore children of them. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And where are they? In Canaan. And they point blank say it. And there we saw the Nephilim. And who are the Nephilim? The offspring of the Watchers. Also known as what? Giants. Watch what they link it to, what they said earlier. The sons of Anak, who were from the Nephilim. And we seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So they're terrified. And they should have been going into the land of Canaan in 1445 BC. But because they were fearful, 40 years will pass to 1406 before they will enter into the land of Canaan. So they're in the wilderness down in this area for 39 more years, just hanging out. And probably nobody in this room has been there, but I've been there. It's not a place you want to hang out for 39 years. There is no shade. There's no water. There's no food. You look this way, and that way, and all you see is sand and mountains with nothing on them. Which is why the children of Israel needed a cloud by day and a fire by night. Else they would have burned up in the day and froze to death at night. It also explains why they needed manna to fall from heaven to feed them together every day but the Sabbath day for 40 years. I remember when I went there 12 years ago or however long it was. I remember going and climbing one of the barren mountains and down by the Red Sea in Timnah. And I just looked and I just took it in. It just really resonated like, dude, hundreds of thousands of people were out here in this. No wonder they complained. Like, I got it. Yeah, of course they complained. It gets up to 140 degrees there. It's hot. There's no sign of life anywhere. And then I thought of Moses. I was like, Moses, God, you had your hands full, didn't you? And I felt sorry for him, honestly. I was like, man. And God expected them to learn things in that barren wilderness. And what He wanted them to learn was man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And that's the one thing they weren't interested in living by. Everywhere God led them, remember, they didn't go anywhere unless the cloud and the pillar of fire moved, which symbolized the divine presence. They were smack dab in the will of God the entire time they were in the wilderness, and they didn't like it. And they didn't learn the lessons So they stayed there for 40 years and they died there. Even though God's desire was to bring them into the land of Canaan so that they could conquer this land just as was promised to Abraham. So they go from Kadesh Barnea and they go this route here. So they go from Kadesh, just ignore this because it's wrong. But they go this route, and this is where I was in the wilderness when I kind of took it all in Timnah, down by the sea. And they come up through what is Jordan on their way to possess the land of Canaan. And they end up, we'll look at the places that they ended up conquered, but they end up going up through Jordan and conquering that region while Moses is alive. And they ultimately come back to Mount Nebo. They come back to the plains of Moab. And they're looking in the land of Canaan. Moses knows that he's not going to lead them in. He let his attitude get the best of him. God said, "You're not going in either." And so Joshua and Caleb are set to take them into the land. And so they're there for 5 months, and we have, because of that, what is known as the book of Deuteronomy. And much of Deuteronomy is Moses reflecting on what they had been through in the wilderness and then reaffirming commandments and things that they need to remember and recall when they get into the land. And so I want to show you some of the verses where he's recalling some of the places that they conquered in the Jordan right before they entered to the land of Canaan. And I want to show you this because this is where you can piece everything together based on who's living in the land and why God would command them to totally destroy certain cities and people. In Deuteronomy 2 and verse 9, and I encourage you to go just read through Deuteronomy before and after this and all around it, because I'm just going to jump around for time's sake. In Deuteronomy 2 and verse 9, the Lord said to me, "Do not harass Moab, who are the descendants of Lot, or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for possession." So notice that God says you can't touch Moab. Don't go to war with them, don't harass them, and don't fight with them. Which is different than what he tells them in regards to certain other cities or people. Why the difference? "For I will not give you any of their land for possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. The Amim formerly lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim." Remember Anak, the Nephilim? The Amim formerly lived there in Moab, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim. So they're Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, and Emim. And why are they Emim? Because that's what the Moabites call them. So you have these interchangeable words that are used to describe these people who we know are giants or offspring of the Watchers, whether you want to call them Nephilim, Amim, Anakim, Rephaim, pick one, it's talking about the offspring of the Watchers. He says, skipping on down to verse 18, he says, "Today you are to cross the border of Moab to Ar, and when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, who are also descendants of Lot, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession." It also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim. So we have these group of giants that are called Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim, and now Zamzumim and Amim, depending on the people group. A people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place. So the Israelites aren't the only ones to do war with the giants. God even used the descendants of Lot to drive them out of that region, and basically kept driving them further north, as He did for the people of Esau, the Amalekites, who live in Seir, when He destroyed the Horites before them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place, even to this day. So God has used the descendants of Esau and Lot to drive them further and further and further north, up through what is today Jordan. As for the Avim, who lived in the villages as far as Gaza, the Kaphtorim, who came from Kaphtor, or Crete, destroyed them and settled in their place. Rise, set out on your journey, and go over the valley of Arnon. He's describing what God told him in their endeavors here. Rise, set out on your journey, and go over the valley of Arnon. Behold, I have given into your hand Sihon, the Amorite. You guys remember that verse from Genesis 15? What was said to Abraham? After 400 years, your offspring will come back to this land, but not until then, because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. Well, let's learn something about the Amorites. Sihon, the Amorite, king of Heshbon, and his land, began to take possession and contend with him in battle. Then Sihon came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Yahatz. And the Lord our God gave him over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all his people. And so this battle takes place here. Notice here's the Dead Sea. They bypass Edom and Moab, can't touch them. But when they get further north, they battle at Yahatz. And we captured all his cities at that time, and here it is, devoted to destruction, Cherem. Every city, men, women, and children, we left no survivors. Why do you think that is? Because there were giants there. And the giants were the offspring of the watchers. And God is bringing judgment upon them and destroying them. And so the thing that they swore, let us be utterly destroyed if we don't do this thing, God is getting the last laugh by utterly destroying them for doing what they swore to do and taking wives to themselves. So it's this area right here, the cities that they overtook. Then chapter 3, then we turned and went up the way to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us, he and all his people, to battle at Edrei. So they're heading up from here to the area of Bashan, which is known today as the Golan Heights. And here's the battle at Adrai that was mentioned here. In reference to the Sea of Galilee, you can kind of gauge where it is in that region. But the Lord said to me, "Do not fear him, for I have given him and all his people and his land into your hand, and you shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon." So the Lord our God gave into our hand Og, also the king of Bashan, and all his people, and we struck him down until he had no survivor left. And we took all his cities at that time. There was not a city that we did not take from them. 60 cities, the whole region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan. And these were cities fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, besides very many unwalled villages. And we devoted them to destruction, or we utterly destroyed, in the King James, Cherem, as we did to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, devoting to destruction every city, men, women, and children. Why? Because they were giants. They were the offspring of the watchers. And God can't flood the earth again, so He's using Abraham's offspring to do away with the offspring of the watchers. But all the livestock and the spoil of the cities we took as our plunder. So we took the land at that time out of the hand of the two kings of what? The Amorites, who were beyond the Jordan, the east of Jordan, from the valley of Arnon to what? Mount Hermon. The Sidonians call Hermon Sirion, while the Amorites call it Senir. All the cities of the tableland or the plain, and all of Gilead, or Gilad, and all of Bashan, as far as Salcha and Adrai, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left, and this is in reference to the east side of Jordan, on that side of Jordan, which was captured under Moses. For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim, or Nephilim, or Amim, or Zamzumim. You with me? Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth. You know how big this king, this giant king was? You know how big his bed was? 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. According to the common cubit, a cubit is 18 inches, roughly from the tip of the finger to the elbow, 18 inches. And what was he? An Amorite, a Nephilim, an Anakim. You get it? I don't have to go through all of them. They all apply. Offspring of the watchers. When we took possession of this land at that time, I gave it to the Reubenites, the Gadites, the territory beginning at Aroer, which is on the edge of the valley of Arnon, and the hill country of Gilad with its cities. The rest of Gilad and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, that is the region of Argob, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. All that portion of Bashan is called what? The land of Rephaim. And so this is not, these maps aren't the best. I know they don't show up the best, especially for those tuning in. We're going to remedy that here soon, but they go up through this region and this region all the way up and capture all of this territory and allot it to certain portions of the Israelites, as we just read. And this happens before Moses dies. right here. And they get ready to go in and take the first city in Canaan, which was Jericho in Joshua. Now I want to fast forward in Deuteronomy. Stay with me. We're trying to find a landing here. In Deuteronomy 7, he moves from rehearsing what had happened in their conquest to giving them a word of caution and encouraging them to do right as they continue the conquest into the land. In Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're entering to take possession of it and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, because if you compare it to the one that was in Genesis 15, it had a few more people groups named. So he chooses a number of 7 to represent the whole. Imagine that. You guys shouldn't find that to be too crazy, since we just finished Revelation and 7 is a number of completion. So he assigns this label of 7 nations, even though we know it contains more different, distinct people groups. And even later on condenses it as to they're all Canaanites, because they're in the land and that land is ours, and so we're going to go in and possess it. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction, or you must utterly destroy them. Again, this is what I read and was troubling. I was like, man, that is harsh if we're just being honest. I remember sitting there in my living room reading this stuff and being like, God, you're going to have to help me understand this. I don't have the audacity to say you have some splaining to do, but I have some learning to do. And I know there's a reason, and I know it's a just reason. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. Again, you read that and you're like, oh, man. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them. I just went from the ESV to the New King James just to show you how the language varies. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons. In other words, you don't need to mingle with mingled seed. You know, oftentimes people read this and they don't realize why there was such prohibition to intermarrying with other people groups. It's because they were offspring of the Watchers. For they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and He would destroy you quickly. So again, here's the land, and here's all these people groups. If you want the full exhaustive list, I will include the PowerPoint in the Facebook group, and you can download it, and you can see all these different names that are used. And they're about to go into Jericho. They're about to go into Canaan. Moses dies, and Joshua takes over. And Joshua takes over when he's 59 years old. He rules for 52 years. They conquer this land. They do war for the next 52 years, to 1354 BC. And you can read through the book of Joshua, and it gives and rehearses the accounts of them taking the land. But I want to read a few portions from Joshua that just drive home the point that I'm making here. Is the reason why God called for mass extermination of these people is because they weren't people. They were giants. They were offspring of the Watcher, and that's why God called for them to be utterly destroyed. So during the conquest in Joshua, in chapter 11, it says, "And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anav, from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities." Again, this is in reference to the Anakim, which we know are who? Giants. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel, except they remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. Now, after Joshua dies, you have what book? Judges. Anyone ever read Judges? It's really depressing. Really, really depressing book. They don't do anything right. They don't fear God, trust God. They'll do good for a little bit and then fall off the wagon. And they're continually fighting with who? What people group? The Philistines. And they fight with the Philistines until David arrives. And the Philistines, guess where they were? Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. And they were what? They were Philistines, but they were also what? Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, Zamzumim, Amim. You guys following me? Giants. Philistines. See that? Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath. Who lived there? Giants. And who did Israel fight for 350 years during the period of the Judges? Giants. In Joshua 12, he's retelling the defeat of what we read earlier, the defeat of Sihon and Og. But I want to rehearse it. I just want to prove to you that they're not killing off just human beings. They're killing off giants and quasi-divine beings. These are the kings of the land whom the children of Israel defeated and whose land they possessed on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising of the sun, east of Jordan. From the river Arnon to Mount Hermon and all the eastern Jordan plain, one king was Sihon, king of the Amorites, who dwelt in Heshbon and ruled half of Gilad from Aroer, which is on the bank of the river Arnon, from the middle of that river even as far as the river Yavok, which is the border of the Ammonites. And the eastern Jordan plain from the sea of Kinneret as far as the sea of Arava, the Salt Sea. So from the Sea of Galilee, Kinneret, down to the Dead Sea, the Salt Sea, that whole plain that I kept showing you on the map, the road to Bet Yeshimot, and southward below the slopes of Pisgah, and Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Salachah, and all Bashan to the boundary of the Geshurites and the Maacathites, and over half of Gilad and the boundary of Sihon, king of Heshbon. Chapter 13. Now Joshua was old and advanced in years. And the Lord said to him, "You are old and advanced in years, and there remains yet very much land to possess. This is the land that yet remains. all the regions of the Philistines. Remember the verse we read a while ago that said where there were still giants? And all those of the Geshurites, from the Shechor, which is east of Egypt, northward to the boundary of Ekron. It is counted as Canaanite. Again, anyone in Canaan could fly under the label of being Canaanite, even though they weren't necessarily direct descendants of Canaan. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines: those of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gat, and Ekron. And those of the Avim. I should have highlighted that as well. In the south, all the land of the Canaanites. And Mearah, that belongs to the Sidonians, to Aphek, to the boundary of the Amorites. It's giving us a broad range here. And the land of the Gebalites, and all Lebanon, toward the sunrise, from Baal Gad below Mount Hermon to Lebo Hamath. All the inhabitants of the hill country, from Lebanon to Misraphot Maim, even all the Sidonians, I myself, will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance, as I have commanded you. Again, think of the territory mentioned in this area. And that's who was left of the giants. And so we have Judges, where they constantly war with these giants, can never seemingly overcome them. Until King David. I'm going to try to speed this up because I know we've been at it a while. To give you a time frame of when this occurs, this is right after Solomon was born. Halfway through David's reign, some of y'all are reading ahead, so I'm going to stop y'all from it for a sec. Right after Solomon was born, about halfway through David's reign, is where this story occurs. And after this, there arose war with the Philistines at Gezer. Then Sibbechai the Hushathite struck down Sippai, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Remember what was said in Joshua, there only remain giants where? In the area of the Philistines. And the Philistines were subdued. And we all know the story of who that was a giant from Gath. Goliath. Everybody knows that story. But they don't realize he was one of 5. Later, there was a battle with the Philistines in Gezer. At that time, Sibbechai the Hushite killed Sippai, one of the descendants of the Rephaim, and the Philistines were subdued. And there was again war with the Philistines. And Elchanan, the son of Yair, struck down Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gitti, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Yet again there was war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, with 24 fingers and toes, 6 on each hand and 6 on each foot. And he was born to the giant. So when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, killed him. And these were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. And after this, you don't hear of another Rephaim, or giant, again. Because God used the Israelites through the conquest with Joshua, and before that with Moses in Jordan, to eradicate the land of these giants, at least physically. When you read the book of Enoch, you realize that when they're killed, their spirits depart and they stay here on earth, and that's what we know are evil spirits or demons. But David and his mighty men finally put an end to the giants. And that happens about 1,000 years before Christ. Which raises the question, why did they never appear again? You ready for this answer? I don't know. My guess is every watcher who chose to rebel against God and procreate and have giants born to them was immediately confined in hell, as we read earlier, awaiting the judgment and being cast into the lake of fire. When you think about it, it tells us how heinous a thing this was for the watchers to do, because we're all familiar with Satan, the arch enemy of God. He was never thrown into hell immediately after he led mankind astray in the garden. He wreaked havoc for thousands and thousands of years and still continues to this day. But the watchers who committed this great evil, who introduced this forbidden knowledge, who procreated and created this quasi-divine hybrid being that we know as giants, God brought them to an end through His people. And it's fitting that He would bring the last of the giants to an end with a king from the lineage of Judah. Because we know that Christ ultimately came from the lineage of Judah. And there's much we could tie in along this theme and along this line to what Jesus did in His ministry. For example, why did He go all the way up to Caesarea Philippi at the base of Mount Hermon and say what He said to Peter in Matthew chapter 16? Why? What's the point? When you understand this backdrop, you can understand. You can understand why God would tell the Israelites, go in and kill everything that has breath. Don't let anything live, because they are not purely human beings. And they have brought great destruction on the earth. They are insatiable, and they must be destroyed. Any questions?
Okay, now you got me? Okay. So the language of utterly destroyed, and you were saying the irony of that is that they were going to be utterly destroyed, because of the pact that they made. Isn't that also what their descendants were doing to the earth and to God's creation? Because in Enoch, it goes on and talks about how they were just completely destroying the earth. They're running out of crops. They're running out of everything. So was it their goal? And I think we touched on this previously, but to destroy God's creation and then thwart His plan to make it a way for us to go through Jesus to be in right relationship with God?
Yeah, I took a different route when I taught it this time, but before I noted that immediately in Genesis you have what is believed to be a messianic prophecy, and her seed will do war with your seed, talking about Satan and his offspring, and how through a human, there would be judgment brought upon Satan ultimately. And that would raise this. I mean, Satan is no dumb entity. I mean, he's very intelligent, one of the greatest of God's creation. That was part of the problem. He used it for his own glory. But if I were Satan and I was told that eventually a human being is going to bring your demise, it's going to crush your head. You're going to bruise his heel, but he's going to crush your head. My strategy would be like, all right, I'm going to kill all humans. And what better way to kill all humans than to create a superior being that's on earth that can usurp authority over humans and do, as we read in Enoch, and destroy mankind. You also read about it in Jubilees, and just take over the earth. And I mean, you think about it, it almost worked. There was such wickedness on the earth, such destruction and violence, that God brought a flood that killed every human being minus 8. Like 8 people short of thwarting the judgment that had to come through a human. And that's why the plan through Abraham and his descendants and keeping the lineage pure was so important through Israelite history, because the Messiah was to be born through a pure lineage, going back to Judah, going back to Abraham, going back to Shem, back to Noah, all the way back to Adam. And so you can't have a dilution. And that's why Jesus ultimately was able to come as a human being. But you have to think that the plan of the enemy could have been to try to do away with human beings. Do away with human beings, you thwart judgment. And so we don't know how involved Satan may have been in the influencing of these watchers. We do know he was a high-ranking angel. You could say he was a type of archangel, a cherubim of some sort. And he had influence. You know, Revelation talks about 1/3 of the angels were duped by him or followed him, rebelled. And so you have to wonder, you know, there's a lot of things we don't know, but I do think it's all connected.
In Deuteronomy 3:9, it talks about the alternate names for Hermon, the Sinir and Sirion. Are those synonyms that are going to have the same root meaning?
No, it's just you have different people speaking different languages, and so they call it this, they call it this, they call it this. You're going to have the most authentic or oldest language that's probably going to be the root that, you know, like Cherem, Hermon. They just spoke different languages, so they called it different things.
I just wondered if they still had the same understanding that this was a very evil place, or where a substantial amount of evil came from.
Yeah. I don't think they would see it that way, because a lot of the people that lived in that area succumbed to the rule of Og and Sichon. So it's hard to know exactly how they would have felt about it or what they would have known in relation to it. We have a question over here, if we can get a mic.
First, I just want to thank you for the teaching. It's very thorough and concise. I'm kind of new to this line of teaching, so I've got some couple of broad questions. The flood destroyed all the giants, completely wiped them out. Only 8 people were left, and then the giants came back after the flood. So they had to procreate again with Noah's family and their descendants, correct? For that to happen. Mm-hmm. Those the only people left on the planet.
Yes.
And then Joshua and David came in and had to utterly destroy them later. Mm-hmm. And there's no other sign of them after that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. I would say, and I'm glad
trying to piece all that together in my head is what's happening.
That's good, the way you piece it together, and it brought something that I neglected to say, that primarily those who were given to allow the watchers to procreate with them were the descendants of Ham. If you track the genealogies and you look at the table of the nations from Genesis 10, the majority of the people groups that allowed the watchers to intermarry and procreate with them can be traced back to Ham, the son of Noah, which when you read that story there in Genesis, after they get off the ark and what Ham did in regards to his mother, it makes sense. And remember what was said? Cursed be Canaan. So God foresaw what was coming, and you have the Canaanites who can be traced back to Ham, who were the primary agents that the watchers procreated with.
Right. One point that's coming to my mind is God is a sovereign God. Nothing is done without Him allowing it to happen, or He knows it's going to happen.
Sure.
So how did, I guess God had to allow the watchers, this group, to do this, right?
Yep.
It all had a purpose. I have a hard time understanding the purpose of all that.
Allowing them and wanting them to do it, I think, needs to be understood. It's not God wanted them to do it, but He created them with free will. And I think that's something that's overlooked in regards to angels or any beings that God creates, is He gives them a will of their own, and they can choose to obey Him or not. And, you could say the same about what Satan did in the garden. That's certainly not what God wanted or willed, but He did allow it. And He also, in allowing it, made a plan to bring redemption and reconciliation, even though Satan did what he did. And same with the story of the watchers. Even though they did what they did, and even though it brought destruction and chaos, in the end, God and His seed prevailed and will continue to prevail until the end of the story, when all evil is ultimately judged, as we read.
So towards the end of the story, then the second group of giants after Noah, after the flood, when they were all utterly destroyed, you commented that God had cast the watchers into hell. Did I hear that correctly?
Correct.
Okay. So they're no longer part of the heavenly realm then. Nope. At this point.
That's what you'll read in Enoch, is because they left the high heaven and did what they did with the women, they were never allowed to ascend back into the heaven. That's one of the pronounced judgments. And a way of doing that was to confine them in the underworld until the time of the judgment at the end. And so they're awaiting to be destroyed, cast into the lake of fire, as we read in Revelation. They'll be a part of the whole group, all who rebel against God, who are cast into the lake of fire after the final judgment.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot of questions. I'll keep coming back.
Okay. I have a question over here.
Thank you. Okay, so didn't you say that you still believe, though, that they're still here?
No. Is it possible, hypothetically? Yeah. I guess, angels are angels. They still could get the wild hair and be like, you know what? We're going to try to get away with what the other guys couldn't get away with. Mm-hmm. You have to think angels are intelligent beings. They've witnessed creation. They're privy to knowledge that far exceeds what we are. And we can learn from mistakes of others. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to think, even if they had a desire to do that, be like, every time one of them did that, they end up in hell. And that would be a deterrent. That we're just guessing, mm-hmm. but that would be a good guess, I think, is that what happened to the others who did it is quite a judgment. I mean, that's it. You do that, that's the last hoorah. Mm-hmm. Off to Sheol you go. Yeah. waiting judgment. So it would be easy to see why they wouldn't do that.
So that kind of evil does not exist as far as what they did, like as far as descendants or any, that was all utterly destroyed.
Yes, yes. Now, I do think there are modernized fly under the radar tactics that the enemy forces of evil have resorted to. And that's where we look into Enoch. We read about the influence of the Watchers. What did they introduce? What made mankind so evil? What did they teach? What did they show? And then we say, okay, what's the modern parallel to that? Where do we see that in our culture? And we may not have giants, but, you know, is there genetic manipulation, modification? You know, there is. Where to draw the line, I'm not qualified to say.
Right.
You know, so I err more on the side of not speaking authoritatively. I have my own strong beliefs about certain things as far as how they modern parallel to what the Watchers introduced. But it's worth pondering. It's worth looking at the list of the things they introduced and being like, what is that today? What does that look like today?
Right, right. So you believe there is people that can truly be evil, and we can also sense it or see it?
Sure. Yeah.
So just kind of in that same line of thought, you see a parallel like with what's going on in Gaza now? Is that like could it be this, you know, that spirit still in that area, just still doing the work, you know, that, you know, the demonic spirits or whatever, you know, causing a lot of the issues?
I think there and anywhere there's such heinous crimes and sinfulness, you could attribute it to a spiritual force that is in defiance to God. Some people will try to parallel it, you know, seeing Israel as still being the people of God, but that would be not correct, because you can only be the people of God through Christ. But do I think that spirits are potentially territorial? I do think so. And they definitely were in that area. So evil continues. But I wouldn't draw some of the conclusions that evangelicals do beyond that. Gary?
I think we might have to draw conclusions or assumptions from this. But so if the angels came to be with the daughters of man, when they had their offspring, is it only to be assumed that they were all male to become giants, or would there have been female giants also? And then those offspring, did man, in order to continue that,
Did the giants keep
right, or was it man that went and procreated with half human, half angel, and continued on along that line?
I'm not sure on the details of all of that. I mean, you do see the trend of them being more male. You know, the giants are usually male figures from the descriptions, at least what we have. What they were able to do, and I've often thought about that, were they able to go on and continue procreating? It appears based on the verses that we did, because you have Enoch, who was a giant, who has children to him.
In other words, was it all incestual instead of back to humans?
Was it incestual
that they stayed within, they bred within themselves.
So once they became a giant, did they only breed giants? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, or did like men go?
I guess whoever they was attracted to. I don't know. They were a perverted group, so I don't know where you could draw the line or how you could know. But that is a very creative, good question. I will have to default to ignorance. See what I live with? We do this to each other, these hypotheticals. That was good.
I have one more.
Okay.
Maybe just one more. So you mentioned that they were immediately bound. Are you using that as a relative term? Because they spent time here to teach people the metalworkings, the makeup, the root cutting, the manipulation, the stars, the clouds, all that stuff. So do we have an estimate of how much time, and at what point does God say, okay, hold on, I took a nap and I missed that? Or that's, of course, a joke, but where did that come from?
That's a good point. It's immediate in that, like, they're not still roaming, but yeah, there's clearly a passage of time, at least with the first wave. We don't have any information about the second wave that come, to my knowledge, where we have as much detail of how they introduced all of this forbidden knowledge. But the passage of time, we don't know for sure. So say they started coming, we don't know if they started coming one at a time, if they all did it all at once. You know, they came in a group of 200 and made the pact, but we're not given specific details. So we can say it happened in Jared's day, Enoch's day, which would be, 6 to 900. So potentially they did it nonstop. You could say at best from then until the flood. And then it happened again after the flood, obviously. So that was a good point, because immediate sounds like they did it and you're gone. So good point. Yes. That is the best that I can put together, at least on the information we're given in Enoch and the absence of information after the flood. So.
And I know I mentioned last week about the ties to like some of our mythology that we have with Greek, Roman demigods and all of that stuff. But there is content on being bound in Tartarus too. Atlas and, all of that kind of stuff that alludes back to I can't remember what it's called in mythology, but they were like a different level of God than the demigod versions that we had on Earth that were worshipped and all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Tartarus is actually the word for hell there in that 2 Peter passage where they're bound. So I definitely think this wasn't limited to the area that we're dealing with the conquest, for sure, before the flood. But to say the extent of the reach and how far it reached, especially after the flood, we just don't have enough information.
Kind of a squirrel question from those things. So you were talking about how the people groups were used to drive out the remnant of giants that were there, but that Esau and Lot were used, their people were used to rid that area prior to when Joshua was sent out to do all that. Right. So I know this is something that we've kind of wrestled with before, why God chose the certain group of people to share his covenant with, and then what was the opportunity for the people who were not within that people group to come to know God and have covenant and right standing with him. But this indicates that, well, I guess Lot is descent from Abraham, therefore he would be included in that people group, but they also weren't specifically part.
They were definitely separate, even Jacob and Esau, even though Esau was from, he was a brother to Jacob. God chose Jacob and over and against Esau, but it's not like they were totally left out. He chose them to work through them covenantally to bring about, working towards the Messiah, giving of the law, all of that. But it's not like God left them hanging without any hope, with no chance for repentance, because immediately in the Jericho story, you have Rahab, the harlot of all people, in a city that is called to be utterly destroyed, everything. And she is rescued because she feared God and preserved the life of the spies. And so that's something we don't know the details of. We have, how God worked through covenant with his people directly. But as far as the other people groups, I don't know. I don't know what God had going with them. But to say that they couldn't have known him or come to repent and, submit to him, I don't think you could say God is just or fair if they didn't have that opportunity. Any other questions? I have a question here. Why do you think it specifically mentions as the days of Jared? Do you think that has anything to do with the genealogy as far as Numbers 960 and 2? I don't know about that. The way I read that in narrative, it's just giving us a time reference of when they were there during the lifespan of Jared, which happens to be a long lifespan of when they could have came. But when you compare it to Enoch, it seems to narrow it a little bit more towards Enoch's life. So not that it narrows it too much more, but it does kind of narrow it a little bit, I think. It says, and then I have another one. Also, to Gary's question, if they, the children of Israel, go back and slaughter the women and children in the towns, they would had to have females. That is, do you follow what he's saying here? This is Dylan saying this, that if God said to go into a town and kill everyone, then some of the women had to have been giants, is the assumption there. That's a fair assumption that was potentially the case, because why would God say kill some and not the others? If part of the goal is to exterminate the giants, why kill the innocent women if there were some there? Good question. I can't ask that question. What y'all